All right, so let's get going. So, well, you know who I am now since I introduced myself briefly. Actually, I just said who I was. I'm based in Belgium, so I work for Intel as what we call a technical marketing engineer. So it means my job is kind of half marketing, half technical. So I do a lot of, let's say, customer community facing work. That means that includes doing things like documentation, setting up demos, helping people on a mailing list, also sometimes through private channels. So with that, I'm usually not, I like to describe myself as not very much of an expert in ACRN, but dangerous enough so that I talk about all topics. But I'm not the authoritative voice on any of those. But in this session now, what I will do is actually, this will be the least technical of all, because what I will do here is really talk about some of the resources that are available as part of the project that can help you on a technical level, but also perhaps more generally about the project. So with that said, what's the agenda for today? I'll talk a little bit about the different online and social media channels that we have. I'll cover some of the resources that are available, mostly from a technical perspective, those ones. We'll talk about the documentation, then we'll talk about how to contribute to the project. And I'm splitting that into two different sections. And one is about what I call the code contribution. That means code patches, features, etc. And the other aspect is the documentation of the project itself. And so I'm kind of splitting these two in because the process is slightly different. So social media and online presence. Well, the most obvious landing zone for people who want to learn about ACRN is through the website, and that's what you see depicted on the center of this. This is the URL. Very simple, https project.acorn.org. From there, you get to the landing page of ACRN. And from that page, you basically have access to everything that is related to ACRN. That means you have direct links from there that will take you to the documentations. You will have direct links to the social media channels like Twitter, like Weibo, WeChat, LinkedIn, YouTube, etc. You have access to the GitHub, where we host the code. You have access to our documentation, which is kind of embedded in the same websites, but it's a slightly different URL, but it's a direct link. And then finally, perhaps one of the most interesting part of this web page is the fact that this is where we post all of the blogs. So we try to create blogs on a regular basis, sometimes very simply to announce a new release. Like as you can see from this screenshot that I took recently, there was a blog posted on April about the release that was version 2.4, but we also try to post blogs on generic topics. So, for example, there was a short blog that was created because Peter Fang from had a session at Embedded World about the orchestration in libvirt, similar to what we described and what we went through this morning. But so what we try to do is also try to create blogs on those so that people can go back and read about that and learn about what was said and discussed. So this is a good resource. It's a generic one, but then from there you actually have links to all of the others. We use the primary social media websites that we use in ACRN are LinkedIn and Twitter. And I've included URLs to the main project landing zones, so to speak. And so in there, we will, again, sometimes repeat or post the blogs or make small announcements on both of them. And in general, what you see on Twitter is kind of replicated on LinkedIn. And vice versa. So I kind of use them interchangeably. The last, well, not the last one, but another one that we use, we have a YouTube channel. In all fairness, it's not extremely active because we don't post videos as much as we post blogs or small announcements. For very simple reasons, these videos take a lot more time to create, especially if we want to make them nice and sweet. And then I should also mention a couple of other resources which are more geared towards the people in China, and that's WeChat and Weibo. So there are other, I mean, sometimes some of these blogs and announcements get translated and posted there, but they may also have separate announcements directly there. But people can correct me, but I believe most of that is done in Chinese. So to me, I cannot understand that. So I'm not actively following them, for example. Resources. So now I'm talking about resources here as mostly you as a user. Let's say if you want to get going with ACRN, you're wondering, okay, what can I use to get started? What are the documentation? Where can I find information about the project, etc. And there are basically three main sources of information and feedback channels that you can use. One is the online documentation. Like I said, it's accessible through the main project website, but you can also directly access it using the URL that I've indicated on the slide. And one thing to note is that by default, it takes you to the very latest version of the documentation. Now, there is a small feature that allows you to go to a specific version, and that can be important because if I take the example of the configuration tool, we've been making some drastic changes on the configuration tool, which means if you are working perhaps on a, let's say on ACRN version 2.2, but are watching the doc or are looking through the documentation from the latest version, then what you will see as documented about the configuration tool will be radically different than what you really have in on your system. So if that's the case, some of it is fairly stable across versions, so it doesn't always affect you that much. But if you know you're going to be sticking to a version for a while, you may want to make sure that you use a proper tag. And we don't have, well, we have pretty much all of the released version available. So as you can see, we have latest, which is what it gets you to by default. And then we have specific tags for the other versions that we have published until now. And it goes back in time quite a bit. So this is where that website is, the documentation website is where we have all of the technical and half technical documents posted. I will go through some of the structure and the organizations on the website in a subsequent slide, but basically all that you can find, whether it's a high-level design documents or tutorials or descriptions of a particular command, is everything we have is posted there. Other resources that you can use, we have a couple of mailing lists that we actively use. One called ACRN users, and then another one called ACRN dev. The difference between these two is ACRN users is really where I would go first for like a first-time questions about ACRN. Things like you've tried to set up ACRN, you run into problem, you want to have a conversation with someone. That's probably the mailing list that you want. You can also go via that website. You can actually do a search on the archives. So if you want, feel free to do a quick search, and perhaps your topic has been addressed or discussed in the past, and maybe there are information in there that's buried that you can dig out and learn from. But otherwise, just feel free to post a new question there. ACRN users it's a fairly low volume mailing list, which means I would advise to subscribe to it because it's not something that will clutter your mailbox that much. The other mailing list that we use is called ACRN dev. That one has a lot more conversations going on. It's more of a high volume mailing list, and the reason for that is it's the one that's also used for all of the patch reviews and conversations around implementation, feature details, etc. So this is why every single patch you see in ACRN has been at some point discussed on the mailing list, and that makes it a fairly high volume mailing list. But a very interesting one. If you're interested, or if you want to keep an eye on what's going on, what's about to land, what's being done, it can be a really good resources. It's also a mailing list that occasionally we may redirect you to from ACRN users. So let's say if I'm trying to help you on ACRN users, if somebody's trying to help you on ACRN users, and we just know that we need like a developer more specialized in a subsystem, that we may ask you to go and post that on the ACRN-dev, because that's where most developers are on ACRN-dev. They're not all watching ACRN users. I am watching ACRN users, so you won't be left alone, but we don't have all of the engineers watching it. So, and we try to use the same typical open source approach to mailing lists, where we keep it in text format and we try to avoid top posting. Now on Acorn users, I'm not as strict, and I'm not very strict either, because some of the tools that most of us use are not always very friendly to these kind of details. So don't be too afraid if you know that you won't be able to respect the format or be like a proper text-based. Will help you anyway. It's if you can, then do it with text and avoid top posting. But if you cannot, then it's fine. We can deal with that. The final resources that you have that can help you is very simply posting your issues on GitHub. This is what we use to track issues and bugs and problems. I personally don't have a preference in between using Acorn users or issues to have a discussion. I would tend, if it was for me, I would tend to start a discussion on Acorn users and then use issues more for logging a proper issue or bug if we realize that there is really a bug that's blocking you, and so that's just an issue. But if you want to really even describe your environment directly on GitHub issues and take it from there, this works for me too. That's you can do either way. It's also a very good idea, just like you can search through the archives from the mailing list and see if the question has been answered or addressed. It's also always, I find, a good idea to also search through the issues and the past issues, even the ones that have been closed, and see if something similar has been discussed or addressed previously. Okay, let me just pause for a quick split second here. Any question on that? On the use of them, or if it's not clear to you what to use when, let me know. Okay, documentation. So the main documentation website. So we do have actually quite a lot of material. It's not complete. It's not perfect. But it's a good source of information, so you can already learn a lot about the various aspects of Acorn. And so this is the main thing. And what I want to do is describe a little bit at a high level how it's organized, so that you can hopefully find your way around it somewhat easily. So this is the main landing page that you will see when you get to the documentation website. And what you see is essentially a number of basically key top-level topics or sections, and these are always replicated on the left-hand side. The little widget that allows you to get to a previous version is what you see here. Can you actually all see my my kind of laser pointer, my virtual laser pointer? Because I keep waving at that, but I'm hoping you'll see it, because otherwise it's fairly useless.
Yeah, it's fine.
You can see it? Cool.
Yep.
Cool. So this is where you can go and select a different version of the code if you want to. Well, actually, a different version of the documentation that matches the version of the code that you use. And on the left-hand side, you have these different sections that are also what you see here. So these are essentially what is Acorn, which is probably where you want to start. And then we have a section that we call Getting Started, a set of sections that are about more advanced guides, and then a section for more developers. Supported hardware and release notes. I mean, release notes, it's self-explanatory. This is where you'll find all of the release notes and historical release notes from the previous releases. So what is Acorn? It's a fairly long document, but it's a good read to really become familiar with Acorn, because it will introduce you to the project, explain a little bit rational what it is about Acorn, and why it's been started, what are the key features, the high-level architecture. So you'll see terms and names being defined there that are useful for you as you go through other parts of the documentation. So things like what sometimes you will see the term SOS or also service VM. So what does that mean? What is it? And so a lot of these are hopefully well described in that document. And you've heard as well through the virtual meetup today, today and yesterday, that we have different terms that we use. User VM is usually what we use as a generic term for a virtual machine, user VM, and then we have the post-launch, the pre-launch, we have the real-time user VMs, and the main one that we always refer to is also SOS. We talk about the service VM, which in the code you'll also find referred to as SOS. Similarly, what we call user VM in the documentation in the code tends to be referred to as UOS, and it's a legacy. It's a term that we used initially, and because it's so widespread in the code, we've kept it in there. That document will also talk to you or explain some of the usage scenario, some of the best known configuration, talk about the licensing, and give you some sort of a high-level architectural view of the different components. Like, so we have the hypervisor itself, we have the device model, we have, and in the device model, we have different subsystems as well. So that's a good first read, a little long, if nothing else, but in my opinion, well worth it to give you a sound and a good base understanding of what ACRN is. Once you've gone through that, the next step is you may want to go to the Getting Started guide, which is essentially what will allow you to get going, to install ACRN on your system for the first time. We have a number of them. The primary one is the Getting Started guide for ACRN industry scenario. And this one will guide you through, and that's what Nandlin covered yesterday. So that one will actually walk you through how you take your system, your NUC, and from scratch install ACRN with a couple of virtual machines on it. And it will take you through the steps for installing ACRN, the different components like the kernel, the services, and then also setting up a real-time VM based on Linux, and then a Windows user VM. We have other Getting Started guides for slightly different scenarios. So like we have one for the hybrid scenario and one for the logical partition scenario. We have a section where we maintain the list of hardwares that are supported. I use the word supported with kind of loosely, because we're not in a position to validate and verify all of the hardware platform with all of the different scenarios and configurations that are possible. So what we validate and verify is always a subset of that. But this is a collection of boards that have that are known to work, at least they have worked in the past, and they're not always actively tested. So your mileage may vary. And so if you have doubts and questions, when there's like a rule of thumb, it's always a good idea to stick to the newest platform, because that's usually what we use the most. But if you have doubts and questions, and particularly about whether a specific feature is supported on a particular platform, then it may be a good idea to just send that as a note on the mailing list and ask us actively. It's our desire over time, one of our desires to publish a list of supported hardware platforms with kind of a mapping of what has been validated and what features are available on those. So this may be coming, hopefully. And so you will also find instructions on how to build ACRN from source, which is required today, because we do not provide binaries or precompiled binaries or ACRN as a package. So this is something that could be interesting, but we don't have that today. So things like installing ACRN from an RPM or for a Debian package, it's not something that's available today. So today the option is to really install and get ACRN from the source code, compile and install it on your target platform. The next section, once you've typically once you've had once you've been able to bring ACRN up on a NUC or on your platform, then this is where you may want to try tweak and change configuration settings and play a bit with ACRN just to see what it's capable of, or even if you have a very particular scenario in mind, this is when you'll start tweaking stuff to fit and to meet exactly your own requirements. So we have a number of advanced guides. We call them advanced guides because some of them are really kind of in the form of tutorials, but tutorials that allow you or that explain how to enable particular features. So for example, we talked about Kata earlier on and how you can use Kata containers with Acorn as a VMM. So we have a tutorial in there. In this advanced section, it's actually under the Acorn feature, this one, that really talks about how to set up Acorn with Kata. We've tried to group them somewhat logically. The first section, which is about configuration in tools, this is where you will find user guides for all of the tools that we have. So let's say if I take the example of the Acorn device model, so Acorn device model is the binary code acorn-dm, and it takes a number of parameters that are always, we wrap them up in a long script, because otherwise they're just way too long to type every time. So it's all kind of wrapped up in a script. But in that section, you will find a user guide that gives you all the details about the different options for acorn-dm, the device model, but also other tools that we have, like the hypervisor shell, for example. Acorn, if you run Acorn in debug mode, you can have a shell into the hypervisor from the serial port, and there are a number of commands that you can run from that shell. And so this is where you'll find the reference documentation about all of these things. This is also where you'll find the documentation about the Acorn configuration toolkits. So like the board parser and the web UI that we use to configure in Twig or define your own scenarios. The documentation about these tools can be found in that section. We have a number of tutorials about service VMs, which are mostly about how to run different operating systems compared to Ubuntu, but just use them as a service VM. So any Linux OS can fairly easily be used as a service VM. If you want to use something else than Linux, then a bit more work would be needed, especially if you want to have the device model available in there. Similarly, we have a set of tutorials about user VMs, and that's mostly about how to bring up different OSs as user virtual machines. So things like a soft real-time machine, or Windows real-time machine, or a Zephyr real-time machine, or Android as well. So you'll find a collection of tutorials in there on how to bring up different OSs in virtual machines. The next section, and so some of them, a bit of caution, because we have quite a number of them. Sometimes some of them get a bit updated, or sometimes you'll see tutorials that reference a particular version of Acorn, like version 2.2. It does not necessarily indicate that you cannot run that on 2.4 or the latest master. It typically indicates that at the time we wrote the tutorial, this is the version that we used. And so we try to refresh them on a regular basis, but we can't keep up with the release cadence and updating old documents. So my recommendation is, if you want to be certain, or if you want to be confident you can bring up the feature you're interested in, use the versions that we reference in the tutorial. And then once you're familiar with the process, try to do that with master. If you're a bit more optimistic, you can directly jump to master, but we may have to debug some problems in real time with if that doesn't work out as planned, because some of the instructions may actually be slightly different and out of date, as things change between versions sometimes. And the final section is debug, where we document some of the tools and techniques that you can use to debug problems with Acorn. And there are really very, very different debug techniques based on what the problem is. So if it's a boot issue, then you really need to be debugging the hypervisor itself, which is probably the most complex piece to debug. But sometimes you also need to debug other problems, like a particular user VM not starting up, or perhaps a specific OS not starting up, or a feature not being exposed correctly and stuff like that. So we have a number of guides that can help you at least do the initial debugging steps. And like I said earlier, you have a set of resources as well available to you through the mailing list or GitHub if more help is needed. The final section that we have in there is the developer reference. And in that one, you will see a lot of design documents. And so this is not So these are not really, they're really not about how do I use that, but they're really more about, okay, how are these things implemented? How is the internal of Acorn working? And so how do we implement Trusty? How do we implement, I don't know, virtual serial port, or how do we implement inter-VM communication, like in the internals of it? And so this is where you will find a lot of explanations. This is a very good set of resources if you want to really get your hands dirty and start looking at the internals of the code, or if you need to patch or fix bugs yourself, then this is probably where you want to take a look at what has been done so far and how it's been done. This is also where we document APIs, and we have a number of guides on how to contribute code and documentation. Again, I'll go through some of that a little later, but no. So this is the main landing page. Like I said, these are the sections, and always you can just navigate through the different sections using the navigation panel on the left-hand side. Code submission. So the code submission process, like at a very, very high level, it's just two-step process. Is one, you send your patches, like your IDs, and even if it's a request for comment, but you can typically the way we do it is you send them on the Acorn dev mailing list, and there they will get reviewed by the developer community and the maintainers. And so you may be asked to make changes or not, and so you'll probably go through a few iterations of that. It's very, very similar, if not identical, to to the development process of the Linux kernel, for those familiar with it. And then the process is, once you've settled on a solution in the code and it's been acted by the maintainer, then at that point, that's when you move that and submit that to the GitHub repo as a pull request. And typically at that point, what you do is it's the final set of patches that you've had, and you include in those in the commit message the fact that it's been acted by, and typically the name will be the one that you got on the mailing list. So that's kind of at a high level. A few things also to be aware of if you want to contribute code is, well, the licensing as usual. So I'm not a lawyer, but with just like with every open source project, it's all released under a specific license that you need to be aware of. We ask for what we call a developer certificate of origin, which is typically implemented via this signed off by. So signed off by is something that you must include in your commit message, and it's typically your name and your email address, so that we can. It's a way. It's for traceability, so we can track who's submitted a patch, and that's required. We ask you also to go through the coding style documents and respect that coding style, but that's typically something that will be addressed as part of the review process. So if there is a coding style that's slightly off, then you'll likely be asked by the maintainer or one of the reviewer to fix that as you go through different iterations on the mailing list. And then we have a set of guidelines as well for the commit message. This is a lot of it is common sense. A good summary of the change, the subsystem that you've modified. So the first line would be typically subsystem, and then kind of a title, a summary of the changes, and then one or more paragraphs that explain a bit more about the changes. And in those, what we'd like to see typically is, what are you changing and why? So the reasons for it and what is the impact. So kind of a up-leveling that. So that means put yourself in the shoes of somebody who doesn't know your patch, and he's going through the Git log, for example, and want to know, okay, what was that change all about? And so reading the code for a change is one way, but it can be the hardest and the most tedious ones. And it's always extremely useful to have a good explanation as to what the patch does in plain English. So try to pay attention to that as well. I think for me, for example, I don't spend all my time coding, but I install debug. And so for me, proper commit messages is something that's extremely useful to help me understand what happened and what was done, and also the why. Meaning, can I revert that easily, or what's the risk if I revert it? I've talked briefly about the signed off by. This is basically how we ensure traceability, but we have also another mechanism where all of the patches, we want to be able to link them to a particular issue. So this is what the trackton does. It's a tag you put in your commit message, and typically you reference a GitHub issue there. One thing I'm not calling out here specifically, but it's there and you'll see it. For every GitHub issue that we have, and the number that, and basically the number that you put here in this trackton field, at some point we need to have like Intel has a database, a Jira database that maps to all of these issues. And so, and it's an Intel thing, we need to have a correlation between these two, which is why if you go through the list of issues on GitHub, you'll very often see the tag that says external system ID and with a number. And so that, and the number looks like ACRN, all capital letter, dash, and then a 4-digit number. So that is our internal reference. If you submit an issue and a patch on GitHub through the pull request mechanism, the first thing you'll see is you actually see like a label being added to your pull request that says trackton, no, not trackton. It will indicate that data is missing. This external system ID is missing, and I think it says, I forgot the exact label, but I think it says Jira ref missing or something like that. I mean, if you've sent a PR, you've probably seen it, so you'll notice that. You as an external user, there isn't much you can do about that. It's something that the engineering team that has access to the Jira instance need to create and cross-reference. So once we do it, we'll remove the label. But before we do it, we can't actually merge the pull request. So don't be afraid by that. It's nothing that you've done wrong. It's just something that we need to do. But since you can't do it, then it typically initially gets flagged as something missing. But the trackdown with the GitHub issue is something you need to do, and the signed off by is also something that you need to follow. We have more complete instructions and guidelines on how to do that, on how to contribute and the coding. I've put the URLs directly on that slide, but essentially you can just go to the main website or the documentation website, and it's in those sections there. Any question on this process? Nope. So let me move on. Next one that I have, this is at a high level how the repository is structured. And if you start making changes, then you probably get familiar with it very quickly. But the key things I want to highlight here are like the top level folders that you see. Device model is all of the code where we have implemented ACRN DM. So this is all about the device sharing, and this is all of the stuff that we run as a user space component in the service VM. The doc folder is where we keep all the documentations, well, with a few exceptions that I mentioned, but 90% of our documentations are in that folder. The next one is the hypervisor. So this is the ACRN hypervisor itself, so the bare metal hypervisor. So if you want to do things from like the low level hypervisor or modifying the ACRN shell and whatnot, you'll find all of the code related to that hypervisor in there. And the last folder that we have is miscellaneous, which is basically a collection of different things. And today, these different things are organized in subfolders in what we call services, which are a set of, let's say, configuration files or services that you can run to set up the network on your service VM correctly, so that all user VMs will have network access and stuff like that. We also have a folder for all of the configuration tools, the code and the data. And we have a third folder, which is hosting some of the debug tools that have been developed specifically for ACRN. It's worth noting that the documentation about these extra tools are typically, it's one of the exceptions. So these are hosted directly in these tool folders. And then the other two files that are important is one is the license files. We've talked about that. So Acorn is released under a BSD3 closed license. So that's the text of the license that you can read and become familiar with. And the other useful resource is if you're wondering who you should ask for particular, well, if you have questions about a particular subsystems, then you have a list of subsystems and the respective owners and maintainers for those. This is what we use, obviously, whenever you send a pull request. This is also what gets used to make sure that it gets assigned to the right reviewer and approver. So other files are in there that you'll see that they're probably more typical files you find, like a make file and then a top-level README. The main repository on GitHub, you'll find that reference left and right here. We use it all the time. So github.com/project/acorn hypervisor. If you go under the Project Acorn GitHub page, you'll notice a couple more repos that can be used. One is the Acorn kernel, because we have a set of kernel patches that are not upstream, and so we maintain a fork of a Linux kernel that includes those for you. So that's the kernel you should be using, and that's what's described in the Getting Started guide. And then another project that's hosted there is the Acorn libvirt. So it's basically a fork of the libvirt components that includes the Acorn driver for it. So if you want to play with libvirt and orchestration, you'll be redirected to that repository as well to install it. Contributions. What about the documentation? So you've seen, if you read through the documentations and you find problems like inaccuracies or things that are plain wrong or stuff that is outdated or things that, or maybe nodes that could be added to help the users, we're happy to, well, we'd love to hear from them. And if you even want to submit a pull request to improve the documentation yourself, that's even better. And so how do you do that is, contrary to the code changes, we prefer to see documentation changes directly sent as pull requests. And it's a very practical reason behind that. It's because it's mainly David Kinner and I reviewing them. And I don't have a good setup to pull patches from the mailing list and read them. That means by the time I read them on Outlook, the formatting is all wrong. And so I can't really, I mean, I can read the content, but reviewing the formatting is mission impossible for me. And then the thing is, because we used restricted text, the formatting in the doc is actually quite important. That means this is why we prefer to see it directly sent as a pull request in GitHub, because from there I can easily pull that, test it, run it, build the documentation, and try to see what it looks like in its final rendering. Which takes me to the next point, which is what we use to document Acorn. We use restricted text. So these are the files with the extension RST. And we also use Sphinx extensions. This is what we use initially. And then we have some built mechanisms that generate a complete HTML website. So exactly the same as what you see on the URL that I pointed at earlier on. You can recreate that entire website from these documents and doing a simple make command. So you just need to install a number of dependencies, build dependencies. But once you have that, from the top level folder, you type make doc, and it will recreate the entire HTML website for you. And so that's usually what I do for testing. So I do a make doc, and then from my browser locally, I just go to that build folder and then look at the HTML version and check what it looks like. Where are all of these files located? Like I said, 90% of them are under the doc folder, with the exception of some of the tools they have a small readmes, and so their own documentation, single page documentation directly in their folder. But if you do a make doc from the repo, all of that gets pulled for you automatically. So you don't have to go into different folders and then pull and build these ones and then collate all of them together. It's all done in one step. The other thing that you need to know, and that's that's described in our documentation as well, is to build the documentation. There are bits and pieces of information that we actually pull from the Acorn kernel repo. So to build a document, you will need to clone the Acorn kernel repository and put it at the same level as the Acorn hypervisor. So you need to have a structure where you have Acorn hypervisor, Acorn kernel on the same level. And from the Acorn kernel, when coding a make doc, it will go and fetch whatever it needs from the Acorn kernel folder as well. So be aware of that. It's usually something that people forget about, and so they get documentation errors when they try to build it, but that's what it is. Some of the API documentations are done using Doxygen, and like I mentioned, once you have all of these, with a simple make command, you can generate the entire HTML websites. And it's rendered exactly the same way you see it on the website today, because that's what we use when we publish that too. So what we like to do is, if you want to send pull requests on the documentation, then you may have to become a bit familiar with the restructure test and how we use it. Now, we have documented in the couple of URLs that are mentioned here. This one, for example, the doc guidelines, you will find lots of information about how basically you structure your documents. I mean, how do you mark a piece of text as being code or a snapshot, or how do you create a header, etc. So all of the stuff that we use is documented there. So that's a good reference for you if you're going to write some restructured text for the documentation. It's something you need to take a look at. It talks about indentation and how to properly format these RST files. There is a tiny bit of a learning curve, quite honestly. It's not huge, but if you're not familiar with it, you need to get used to it. It's slightly more complex than Markdown, but it's similar in spirit. But once you know it, then it's easy enough to use, and it's quite powerful in what it allows you to render and to do with cross links and internal links, etc. The other link that I'm included in this document is the set of instructions for you to be able to build the documentation. So the HTML web pages with all of the documentation. So you need to install a number of tools that are not described of the Getting Started guide, because the Getting Started guide really focuses on building Acorn itself, so the device model, the hypervisor, the tools, but by default, it never builds the documentation. We assume that people don't necessarily want to build documentation, and so this is a separate build target with a separate set of requirements, and so that's what that document. If you want to venture in that space, you need to take a look at that document and read through it to make sure you have got all of the tools installed on your system for that. Any question on how to contribute to documentation? Okay, well, so that's the end of my session, actually. So I've used up, it's what time is it now? 11:05. So yes, I've taken a bit more time than I thought I would. So first of all, thanks very much. Like I said, what I really would like you to do is take a look through all of the resources. If you want to contribute, please do so. We welcome contributions. It's always helpful for us, whether it's in terms of features, code patches, but even documentations. Every little helps. I mean, documentation there is a broad set. And so, like I said, we don't always go through every single document that we have at every release. So if you try something that's slightly out of date and you know how to fix it, we would really appreciate it if you would take the time to send us the feedback, or even send the patch directly to fix the documents and update them. And with this, let me conclude my presentation and open up for questions. We have another 4 minutes before the official start time of our break. So if you have any question, raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask.
There's a question on the chat window.
Say that again?
I think the question on the chat window.
Ah, let me just check because I don't see the chat window where I am. Let me actually chat. Okay. Oh, how long will we keep information on all releases of Acorn? So if the question is about on the website, we have not really decided. It's not consuming a lot of resources on the website, quite frankly. It's not using a lot of disk space and stuff, so it's not really a problem to keep them. What we've been looking at them, thinking that perhaps some of these minor releases are not that useful to keep, and so the balance we may want to stroke is really perhaps remove some of these tags from the online website, so that when you go and want to check the different versions, then you really have a limited numbers, like basically the main ones. But I must admit we're kind of open to suggestions and feedback or wishes from you on that. Now, the one thing to note is it's while we may not keep all of them on the public website, everything will stay in the code. So that means once you have cloned the repo, you have access to all of the documentation. You just check out a particular tag, and you can regenerate that documentation with a simple make doc command, like I mentioned. And so it's also very straightforward for you to, even if we take it down for whatever reason, let's say if we just decide that, okay, 1.5 was not a major release, and so we just remove it. But if for whatever reason you were particularly interested in 1.5, for you to access that version of the documentation, it's a git checkout for the 5.1 tag, make doc, and then save that as a website somewhere internally. But like I said, we don't have really plans to remove them, although I suspect at some point, once we get to too many releases, we may want to clean up a little bit that. So any input or feedback, I'll take it, and then we'll see what we do. Does that answer your question, Martin? No problem. That's good. Any other question? Oh, welcome, Robert. I saw your note. Let me know if you have any questions as well about any of that. So with that, folks, then if there are no more questions, microphone or chat, I'm keeping an eye on the chat now. I don't see anything else, so I think that means we're all good. So it's 11:10. We're back right on schedule, and so let's all take a break, 20-minute break, and we reconvene at 11:30, and so that we can take a look and go through the final two sessions of the day, which are, let me just bring up the agenda again. Debugging Acorn. Let me share. Yeah, debugging Acorn, and then starting at 11:30, and then the next one after that, starting at 12:10, is about inter-VM communication. And then we'll have 10 minutes to wrap things up and conclude this virtual meetup. So folks, so let's start this break and get back here around 11:30 for the next session.